Last time, we examined Gaius Marius's entree to political life. Today, we will set the stage for his involvement in the crucible of the Jugurthine War. As we discussed in Part 1, the power vacuum left by the collapse of Carthage had wide-reaching consequences for the Mediterranean world. In the last major war between Rome and Carthage, Rome was assisted by a number of foreign allies, none more steadfast than King Massinissa of Numidia. Massinissa was the son of Gaia, chief of the Massili, a Berber people native to what is now Algeria. The name Berbera first appears in Egyptian inscriptions of the 14th dynasty, or about 1700 BCE. The Berbers speak a series of Afro-Asiatic languages that are often mutually unintelligible. In antiquity, they were known as cattle ranchers and horsemen, living in small mobile settlements. When the Phoenicians first came to North Africa as colonizers, they easily outmatched the native Massili in military and technological matters. For the first several centuries, the Carthaginians strictly forbade any association between themselves and the Massili, or any of the other Berber tribes for that matter, in an attempt to stop the technological advancement of the natives, and thus preserve their technological advantage. Of course, that was impossible. The Carthaginians could not help but change the Berbers around them. By 218 BCE, the Massili had formed an organized kingdom to rival the Carthaginians. The ruler of this kingdom was named Massinissa. Massinissa was raised as a political hostage in the city of Carthage. This tactic was used as a way of ensuring the loyalty of the Massili. Therefore, when the Romans invaded North Africa, the Massili fought valiantly against them on the side of the Carthaginians. Massinissa would personally see combat against the Romans both in North Africa and later in Spain, as the commander of a unit of elite cavalry. In that capacity, he led a guerrilla campaign in the hills of Spain, hitting Roman forces, then melting away into the wilderness. These hit-and-run tactics worked until they didn't. Ultimately, Massinissa would suffer a series of devastating battlefield losses, convincing him of an inevitable Roman victory over Carthage. In a shocking betrayal, he defected to Publius Scipio Africanus, hero of the Second Punic War. Massinissa was a quick study, and he would learn much about his new allies. Of special interest was their transactional nature. The Romans seemed to him to be motivated almost entirely by money. They oftentimes assumed the same was true for other people as well. For example, they enticed Massinissa to defect with the promise of the kingship of Numidia. True to their word, when the Romans defeated Carthage at the end of the Second Punic War, Massinissa was duly installed as king. He successfully united the diverse Berber people by introducing advanced agricultural techniques developed in Carthage to the numerous semi-nomadic peoples of North Africa. Under his leadership, Numidia became an economic and military match for the much diminished Carthaginian Empire. Noting his kingdom's growing power, Massinissa soon was overcome by a desire to expand his kingdom. Of course, his new expansionary policy came at the expense of Carthage. Due to a restrictive treaty signed with the Romans at the end of hostilities, the Carthaginians were forbidden from using their arms to defend their own territory from the Numidians. The inevitable result was a resumption of hostilities between the two powers. In 146 BCE, the Romans were drawn into the Third and last Punic War. Massinissa was not happy about this development. He did not want to see the Romans involved in what he understood as a purely African struggle. Rather, he hoped that he could defeat Carthage himself and incorporate all of its former lands into his own kingdom. But that was not meant to be. Massinissa was fully prepared to lead the fight against the Romans himself, but he died at the age of 90 before he could get the chance. Carthage, for its part, would be utterly destroyed. its lands were annexed by the Roman Senate as the province of Africa. Upon his death in 148 BCE, Massinisa's kingdom was divided among his three heirs by none other than Scipio Aemilianus. To his eldest son, Micipsa, went the capital of Numidia, along with its palace and treasury. To the middle child, Gulusa, went command of the Numidian armies. And to the youngest, the illegitimate Mastanabal, went the tasks of justice and diplomacy. This arrangement never had time to degenerate into infighting and jealousy, as Gulusa and Mastanabal both died of unnamed diseases early into the brothers' joint reign. Micipsa would rule Numidia alone for the next 30 years. His policies were largely an extension of his father's. He maintained his father's alliance with the Romans and sent them troops for their various military adventures. Micipsa, like Massinissa before him, had three potential heirs. The first two were his natural children, Adherbal and Hempsal. The third was Jugurtha. Jugurtha was extraordinarily popular with the Numidian people. This posed a problem for Micipsa because while his own children had much stronger claims to the throne, they were less capable and ambitious than Jugurtha was. To try and protect the claims of his natural children, Micipsa sent the young Jugurtha to Hispania to participate in the siege of Numantia in 134 BCE. There, Jugurtha met and mingled with the likes of Scipio Aemilianus, Tiberius Gracchus, and of course, our very own Gaius Marius. His close contact with the Romans gave him an important insight into their character and customs, not unlike Massinissa before him. Indeed, he came to a similar conclusion as his grandfather. The Romans were quite vulnerable to bribery. In fact, Sallust tells us Jugurtha's thoughts on Rome and the Romans, saying, Sed postquam Roma egressus est, ferter saepe eo taci. But after Jugurtha had left Rome, it is said that oftentimes looking back at it, he would say quietly, Such a corrupt city, and it would soon perish, if only a buyer could be found. Just before his death in 118 BCE, Micipsa seemed to grasp the enormity of the problem he had in Jugurtha. Fearing that Jugurtha would usurp the kingdom of Numidia from his sons, he adopted Jugurtha and commanded his kingdom to be divided in three, as it was at the death of Massinissa. This time, however, the arrangement wouldn't work. When the princes met to divide the kingdom, tensions became overt. No satisfactory conclusion came of the meeting, and each heir withdrew to a different part of the city. Hempsal happened to spend the night at the house of one of Jugurtha's most trusted retainers, who permitted an assassin to murder him as he slept. Adherbal and Jugurtha soon made civil war on each other. However, Adherbal was not a match for the military skill of Jugurtha. He was defeated in battle and fled to Rome to petition the Senate to execute the will of his father and partition the kingdom between himself and Jugurtha. When the senatorial delegation came to Africa to settle the score, Jugurtha bribed them into giving him the wealthier and more fertile portion of the kingdom. Adherbal accepted this defeat and made peace, only for Jugurtha to freshly declare war on him just a year later. With this new declaration of war, Adherbal retreated to his capital city in Cirta, and here he resisted Jugurtha with the help of many Roman equites. These equites living in Africa were mostly businessmen and merchants that had settled there during the reign of Micipsa. Despite repeated requests from them to the Senate for help, and the equites' assurances that the Romans would certainly relieve the siege of Cirta, no help ever did come from the capital. Eventually, Jugurtha broke into the city, deposed Adherbal, and killed the entire Roman population. News of the massacre was met at Rome with a mixture of disbelief and then outrage. The Roman people demanded action from the Senate. Soon they would have it. In 112 BCE, the Roman Senate declared war on Jugurtha. They dispatched the consul Lucius Calpurnius Bestia to lead the military response. When Bestia arrived in Africa, he received a message from Jugurtha's father-in-law, Bocchus I, king of Mauritania, offering him an alliance. When this news reached Jugurtha, he immediately sued Bestia for peace. The Romans, hoping to save themselves the expense and bloodshed of a military campaign, offered Jugurtha a peace treaty on extremely lenient grounds. Jugurtha could keep his kingdom in Numidia, but in exchange he had to give up his war elephants and pay a series of fines to the Senate. To the Roman people, this smelled a lot like another instance of Jugurtha bribing the Senate. Predictably, it led to another round of public outrage, which prompted the Senate to summon Jugurtha to Rome. There, Jugurtha was expected to stand trial before the Senate. That trial was a fiasco. Rather than be summoned to testify, Jugurtha bribed the tribune of the plebs to use his veto power to stop the whole Inquisition. Meanwhile, Jugurtha's cousin Massiva, who had previously fled to Rome for fear of his life, took this opportunity to testify on the Senate floor. He told the Senate that if they should just support him against Jugurtha and make him king of Numidia, he would be a better friend to the Romans than Jugurtha ever was. When Jugurtha heard this, he promptly had Massiva assassinated, and then sent bribes to the Senate to escape any consequences for his actions. This new instance of bribery would have been effective had it not been for the public outcry, which once again forced the Senate's hands. In 110 BCE, they sent another consul to take over the military operation in Numidia. This time, Spurius Postumus Albinus led the Romans on a campaign against the seat of the Numidian treasury in the heavily fortified city of Suthul. Jugurtha, a far better military tactician than Albinus, led the Romans into the Sahara Desert before turning on them. Half of the army was killed outright, and the survivors were made to pass under the yoke. This action was the traditional humiliation reserved for a completely routed army. The defeated Albinus reaffirmed the same lenient peace deal that Jugurtha had signed with Bestia. But the Roman Senate could not let the outrage stand. They refused to acknowledge the treaty and sent another military commander to be done with Jugurtha once and for all. This new commander and consul for the year was none other than Quintus Caecilius Metellus, a name that you might recognize as Marius's commander during his service in the Jugurthine War. However, this Quintus Caecilius Metellus was confusingly the first cousin of Marius's old commander. To distinguish the one from the other, we oftentimes refer to them by their honorific titles. The one Bellaricus for his role in conquering the Balearic Islands, and the other Numidicus. You might guess why. The Romans were always known for their creative names. But there's another problem with this story. Some of you might be thinking at this point, hey, wait a minute, I thought Marius lost his connection to the Metelli way back in part 2 of this series. Of course you're right, dear listener. It seems that this Quintus Caecilius Metellus selected his staff for their merit rather than their political bona fides. And evidently, Marius's reputation as a soldier was more important than petty political disagreements. Selecting men for their ability rather than their class or political connections would be a lesson that Marius would not soon forget. Join me next time to see how. I'm Matt Lupu. Thanks for listening.